because of our teaching, there are 7 dispensations in God's dealing with man. The first dispensation of God is called the dispensation of innocence. That's when man truly was young. You know, when Adam was created, he was innocent. He was simple at heart. The serpent came to him and said, did God say you should not eat of the trees of the garden? And he couldn't discern. If he was aged in the spirit, he would have known that the serpent meant no good. He would have known that the serpent was not suggesting anything. The serpent was trying to route the path of rebellion so that he will fall from glory. But he wasn't wise. And he began to dislodge things. No, we must eat. We must not eat of every tree in the garden. Of all the trees we can eat, but the one in the middle of the garden, we must not eat or touch. They didn't tell you to announce it. They gave it to you as a code of existence. But he didn't know that the serpent was older than him. And the serpent told him, no, you will not die. What do you mean die? You came from God. How can you die? The serpent told him, you will become as wise as God. And God knows. That's why God is hiding it from you. This is to suggest to this man that there has been a politics going on before I came here. Why is this being accusing God when he has no challenge with God? But the guy was innocent. His heart was simple. And so he fell to the deception of the devil. And so the first dealing of God with humankind and the dispensation is called the dispensation of innocence. So that dispensation is between the time of creation and the time of the fall of man. Then, after man fell, another dispensation was activated. So God began to deal with man based on his conscience. Anything the man thinks is right because there's a moral law that God planted in the soul of man. So without even having a law, the man knows intrinsically what is right from what is wrong. He knows intrinsically certain things that he should do. So now that salvation is not yet accessible, God decided for the man to function based on conscience. And if you study Romans chapter 2, you are going to see that those who didn't know Christ, they will be judged based on their conscience. Because that was a dispensation of God's dealing with man. And that was what propelled the actions of man. In fact, if you study Genesis chapter 4 verse 3, the Bible said, in the course of time, it said, okay, be putting these scriptures, write them. It said, in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the first fruit of the ground an offering unto God. God didn't ask for offering. But there was something in them that made them perceive that it is right to honor the Lord. And so God was dealing with man based on those righteous perceptions, those conscience-based perceptions. I beg your pardon. And then Abel, he also brought of the firstling of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. So the dealing of God was subject to the quality of your conscience. That was a dispensation. So that dispensation lasted from the fall of man to the flood. When the earth was wiped off, another dispensation was open. And so God saw that conscience will no longer work. At this point, earth had become evil. And man wants to test independence. So God allowed man to establish his own government. And so the third dispensation that came became the dispensation of human government. That's why you saw that the earth started being populated. Different tribes began to emerge. And man began to create system of governance for himself. It was that dispensation that led to Genesis chapter 11, where the Tower of Babel was built. Let us build a tower that goes as far as heaven. Let's stand with this God and rub shoulders with him so that we too can establish power and governance. And so that dispensation operated like that. And in that dispensation, God looked for certain men that still had regard for his kingdom. And he was dealing with them underneath. It was in that era that you had men like Noah. And they were having dealings with God under that canopy. But the world largely was ruled by human government. And so all the men of the earth came together and said they will build their own government. And the seat of that government will be as high as heaven. Until God decided to divide their language and they were spread abroad. So tribes and nations emanated from that dispersion that took place. And then God now decided among the many tribes across the earth, he will start another unique relationship with man. So he called a tribe for himself, beginning with Abraham. So it activated another dispensation called the dispensation of the promises of God. So in Genesis chapter 12 from verse 1, you see that God called Abraham out of the many tribes that were establishing their own empires and their own government. So this was no longer God's affair. That was why God had to call man out of it. He now said to Abraham, get thee out of thy country, get thee out from thy kindred, and out from thy father's house unto the land that I will show you. I want to start something with you because men have matured to a height of rebellion and they have built a government unto themselves. I cannot interact with them. Come out of them. Let me start a new order, an ordinance with you. And he said, and I will make you a great nation. So this is a new nation. The nations of the earth are a government of rebellion apart from God. I want to start my own nation with you so that my government and my ordinances will rule over you. This is why God chose Israel. And this is why it was through Israel that a new race is born. This is why we who are here today are a type of Israel in the spirit. Because this is the government that recognizes the supremacy and the sovereignty of God. It started with Abraham. Now, in the context of this new dispensation, men of necessity were also interacting with the government that was in the world. Other things had to happen. So God opened another dispensation in the time of Moses. Because this time, hunger led Jacob to Egypt. And he had mingled. Men mingle. He had mingled. God called them apart to operate by new set of rules. Once upon a time, you will read that they always love going to Egypt. I don't know why. I don't know why. There's a system in Zion. Why do you love going to Egypt? So, since you love going to Egypt, I will use one of my sons in Egypt to bring deliverance. So, but a day will come when I will call you out. And I'm going to go into these details to show you some things. Right? So, God decided to create another system to purge them from the world system. So, he started the dispensation of the law. So, in the dispensation of the law, God showed man his standard. I called you apart. You need to know that my ways are not the ways of the world system. My standard is not the standard of the world system. These are my ways. These are my laws. And it's on the basis of my ways and my laws that I can relate with you, even though I called you apart as my people. If you don't subscribe to my laws, I can't work with you. Exodus 19, verse 5 and 6. I'm showing you some things. This person. Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice, indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. What will cause you to now walk with me is that through my laws, through my voice, you will be purged from the corruption. Because Egypt had entered them so deep. While they were in the wilderness, they said, no, we'll go back to Egypt. We enjoy garlic. We want to go back to what was. Why did you bring us here? You need purging. You need purging. You have crossed the Red Sea, but Egypt is in your heart. And so the way I will deal with the Egypt of the heart is to give you laws. Are you following? So another dispensation opened called the dispensation of the law. But God saw after a long time that man's weakened nature could not support fulfilling the law. If you study Romans chapter 8, verse 1, you will see what the Bible said. Read it, verse 1 and 2. My emphasis is in verse 2. It said, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Because when they were operating the law, they were powered by flesh. But see the problem of the flesh. He said, for the law of the Spirit of life has set me free from the law of sin and death. What's the next thing? The law of sin and death is Egypt. He said, for this is Egypt in the spirit. It's the spirit of Egypt. Those are our Egyptians following. I'm not talking to you. Egypt is a spirit before there's a geographical entity that spirit operates. So you'll find it in Isaiah. But that's not my teaching. Before an Egyptian say, Is it that we are not part of God's agenda? You are. It's the spirit of Egypt we are talking about. It said, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through what? The flesh. So God saw that what he wanted to achieve, the law can't do it because the flesh is weak. So what God decided to do was to activate yet another dispensation. And it's called the dispensation of grace. So the law can't travel deep into you to excavate the powers of Egypt and the flesh. So what I will do is that I will bring the new technology called the technology of grace. And so the dispensation of human government began from the flood to Abraham. The dispensation of the promise began from Abraham to Moses. And the dispensation of the law began from Moses to the coming of Christ. Then you have the dispensation of grace. The dispensation of grace began from the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ. That's where we are now. So we are currently in the dispensation of grace. And then after the dispensation of grace, you have the dispensation of the kingdom, what you call the millennial reign, where Christ will live and rule among men. If you study Revelations 22, the Bible said that world, that city will not need the sun. It said Christ will be the light of that city. So a dispensation is coming where the kingdom of God will become the operating system of your life. You will know him as you are known. At that era, sin will no longer exist, and there will be perfect righteousness and perfect obedience. So we are in the dispensation of grace, yet to be translated to the dispensation of the kingdom.